Hello and welcome to Guider. Welcome to the Guider Talks. Today we have the wonderful, eminent Mr. Ben Potter with us, and we are looking at how to separate serious buyers from the tire kickers. This is in a time when sales, business development, marketing, positioning, all these things are more important than they've ever been, because we are, as I was just alluding to before I hit record, we are in quite difficult times. Agencies are finding it harder, slower to win clients. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Ben. The way we're going to run the session today is we're going to give Ben a kind of a straight sort of 15-minute run at what's going on, so he can set up the his argument, and then feel free to put questions into the Q&A, and we'll sort of break it down into a Q&A. We will finish on the dot of the hour. Hello, Mr. Anthony Steers. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Ben Potter. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I think as sort of before I really jump into it, just for a little bit of context as to what we're going to be talking about today and why. As Robert has alluded to, and I don't need to tell you, it is a bit of a strange market out there. It has been a little bit strange for some time now. I can't remember the last time we had a normal year. So 2023 was difficult for many agencies, not all. And I think if you saw Robert's State of the Nation presentation a few weeks ago, or if you went along to the Wow Company's Bench Press launch party last week, it's both anecdotal and now we can see it in the actual data. 2023 was a tough old year. I think for a lot of people, the beginning of 2024 has been more positive, but equally, I think we're probably still in for a little bit of a bumpy road ahead of us for the rest of the year, possibly into 2025. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's the general feeling out there. Now, if we start to put that into a new business context, what does that mean in terms of new business? These are the sorts of symptoms that you may have well seen and felt over the last kind of 12 months or so. You may well have seen or felt what are sort of more speculative inquiries coming through. Buyers are looking for quick fixes, they're looking for better results, maybe they're looking for lower fees. So you may be getting those inquiries through, but they might feel a bit more speculative in their nature. I think you're going to find when you start speaking to people, they tend to be a bit more risk adverse. You need to work harder to kind of build that business case to get people to invest or to make a change. There's probably been more stakeholders involved in the decision-making process as well. Very rarely now do we have one person who has the ability to make an important strategic decision when bringing in a new agency. And almost certainly you felt greater price sensitivity. When it gets to that point in the conversation, it's inevitable that people are asking you to lower your prices in an effort to get more bang for their buck. So with respect to what we're going to be talking about today, I think the overriding theme, regardless of who I've spoken to in the last 12 to 18 months or so, the overriding theme has been, whether you're doing good, bad, or indifferent, when it comes to the sales process, there's been more dither, delay, indecision, things going on hold. Even when contracts have gone out, they don't come back. You think you're starting a project next week, and then for whatever reason, it might be another month, another two, and then all of a sudden that project is dead. So it's taking longer to get things moving. And I think what that means in terms of the sales process is you really need to double down hard on the first conversation in the sales process. So what I'm going to be talking about today is what I describe as the qualifying conversation. So the scenario is such that you have been approached by a prospect. You've received an inquiry via your website, or God forbid, the phone has rung and somebody has said, we are interested in working with your agency. So the first conversation you're going to have is what I would describe as a qualifying style conversation. Now, this conversation would not be appropriate if you were, for example, doing some outbound activity, reaching out to somebody, they say, yes, let's have a conversation, it would be highly inappropriate to then go into a quite a hard kind of qualifying style conversation at that point, because they're not necessarily in the market right now. So the scenario, just to make it very clear, is an inquiry has come in. How do you manage that initial conversation? Now, just as a quick straw poll, there is a chat function here. Can you just put a yes or a thumbs up in there if you think about your lead time, your average lead time? So from when an inquiry comes in through to the point at which you close that business, did that increase? Even if you don't know the number specifically, it might be anecdotal. Did that lead time increase in 2023 compared to the previous year? Up a lot, says Simon Wharton. And yes. Aaron, yes. Increased by up to 6 weeks, says Roger. Andre says no. Simon Wharton says, and actually worse this year. Steve Grant, yes. Nina, not really. Robert Craven, yes. So there's probably, I don't know, roughly an 80-20 split there. So for most people, they certainly saw that lead time increase last year. So the aim of today is to try and really kind of weed out those kind of, for want of a better phrase, time wasters, tire kickers, and so on, and really be able to focus your attention on those that are in the market and in a position ready to buy. So I'm just going to share my screen with you for a moment. Bear with me. So you should be able to see that. Fantastic. So as I said, what this really means in terms of trying to reduce that lead time down is that you really need to double down on your approach to qualifying, to be even more robust in how you weed out the serious buyers from those kind of time wasters and tire kickers. And that means that when a lead comes in, rather than speed up, we need to slow things down. And typically, as agencies and also as buyers, we're not very good at slowing things down. We tend to get very excited and we tend to rush far too quickly towards a proposal or presentation. So this is typically what I see before going into an agency and doing some sales training and putting in place a more robust sales process. This is often what I would tend to see. Now, this is kind of exaggerated in a way for kind of comedy purposes to some extent, but this often will happen. An inquiry will come in, there'll be one phone call or meeting, and the questions posed during the course of that tend to be very service specific. So if it's an SEO inquiry, all the questions will be about traffic and rankings and conversion rate. The questions aren't broad and bigger picture enough. Everybody gets very, very excited and the agency commits to writing a proposal. They go away, they spend hours and hours second guessing what needs to go into that proposal, putting shopping lists of options in there, all these different ideas, giving away all that expertise and time for nothing. They fire that over via email, and then they never hear from the prospect again. And if they do, it's after repeatedly chasing, only to be told that we're going to stick with the incumbent. How frustrating. What a waste of everybody's time. But this happens over and over and over again. And this is actually reflected in some stats. Again, just kind of tying back to last year's bench press report from the Wow Company. It's actually represented in what I think are some fairly appalling conversion stats when it comes to how many proposals actually turn into paid clients. Just 17% of agencies convert 61% or more of their proposals. At the other end of the scale, almost half of agencies are converting less than 40% of their proposals. I think those numbers represent a huge amount of wasted time, energy, resource, mental energy, brain power to work through a whole sales process and ultimately get nothing at the end of it. I firmly believe that you as an agency, if you are well positioned and if you are robust in your sales process, if you are good at weeding out the serious from the tire kickers, you should be converting at 60 to 70% of the time, at least. And that's not just about being better at converting proposals, it's being better at weeding out people who are not the right fit, who are not in the market and not ready to buy from you. So with all of this in mind, I'm going to share some ideas on how you can spend more time on opportunities you stand a good chance of winning, and spend less time on those opportunities that you don't. And we're going to look at that first stage of the sales process, the qualifying conversation. So firstly, let's just sense check. What do we actually mean by qualifying? Essentially, it's a vetting exercise. As I mentioned earlier, it's most appropriate for leads that are coming into you that are seemingly at the start line. They're not always at the start line, but they are seemingly at the start line and ready to buy. But that isn't necessarily always the case, so we shouldn't always make that assumption. The client is coming to you and vetting your agency to see if you are a good fit for them, and from your point of view, you are looking to establish if you are a good fit for them. But what I tend to find is that vetting process, that qualifying conversation, it doesn't go deep enough. It's often rushed in the mad dash to get to a proposal. And it's something that often is deemed to only happen at the beginning of the process, rather than actually qualifying is not a one-time event. It's something that actually needs to happen at various points through the sales process. It should be a collaborative process between you and the prospect. It's collaborative in the sense that it's not just them making a load of demands and asking questions on you. It's you also asking key questions of them and trying to gather the right information so you can make a decision if they're the right fit for you. And when it gets to the proposal, it's also about coming up and working the solution together. It's not just about you going away and coming up with all these ideas and hoping when you present they're going to be right. It's working in collaborative fashion to make sure the proposal is correct when it gets to that point. As a general rule of thumb, and this is slightly outside of what we're covering today, but your proposal should be confirmation of what you have broadly already agreed verbally with the prospect. It shouldn't be a Don Draper big reveal, big surprise at the end, hoping that your idea or your plan or your solution is right. So if you just think about that one rule alone, take that away today and think about how that would change your approach to the sales process. Now, the ideal starting point for a qualifying conversation is to have a really, really good idea of what your ideal client looks like. So this is a fairly simple but useful version of what I call an ideal client profile. There are variations on what people may call it, but for this particular agency, they work with scale-up e-commerce brands, and then we've mapped the key sectors they work in, the traits, so the sort of the size, budget, what does their marketing team typically look like, what is the culture like, what is their kind of situation typically as they go to market, what are the key problems they may be facing, what roles do we typically look to engage with, and what's the mindset of those people that we look to work with as well. So I'm happy to share this deck with you afterwards. You can get a copy of this. There is a link to an article that I've written about this as well, so you can go and read up a little bit more. And if you don't have an ideal client profile, really go away and think about what does your ideal client look like and get it down on paper. This is your qualifying framework. This is what you are qualifying against when you have these early stage conversations. It doesn't mean we never compromise on this. We would be naive, particularly in the current climate, to say we're only ever going to take on clients that are the perfect match. There will be situations when you do decide to take on clients that may fall outside of this. But what this framework gives you is a framework to be able to kind of share feedback with the team as to why you're taking on a client. Where have we compromised? Why have we compromised? But in an ideal world, this is kind of what we're aiming for when we have these qualifying conversations. So a lot of this can actually be gleaned before you even jump on a call. So if you get that inquiry through, do that little bit of desk-based research. You know, broadly speaking, do they look like a good fit? And if they don't waste your time jumping on a call to find that out. Drop them an email, politely decline. If you've got a network of other agencies, maybe you pass business to, that's where that would come into play. And you would say, look, I've got a couple of others. We're not quite the right fit, but here's a couple of other agencies you can go and speak to. But assuming you do that desk-based research initially and decide, actually, this is worth our time, it's worth having a conversation, what I'd recommend you do is tee up the qualifying conversation. So what I mean by that is we would drop them an email and we would provide a broad outline of what we are going to cover on this first phone call. It's not quite an agenda, but it's along those kind of lines. So I will share this kind of copy with you as to how you do that. And then we're just going to break it down a little bit and I'll explain the importance of these words. And there's only about 70 or 80 words here, but actually they really are quite powerful when you start to really think about the language used. So you'd say something like, we tend to work best with clients who, and then you describe your typical client. What is their kind of typical situation? Only needs to be a couple of lines. It doesn't need to be chapter and verse. The purpose of this first conversation is therefore to establish if we are like to be a good fit for you and vice versa. I've got a few questions I'd like to throw your way, and I'm sure you'll have a few questions for me too. If we get to the end of the call and agree in principle that there's a good fit, I suggest we arrange a second meeting where we can explore your requirements in more detail and how we'd work together. We can also bring in some of the subject matter experts from our side and anybody from your end that needs to be involved. How does that sound? Now, as I said, there's only about 70 or 80 words here, but there's actually quite a lot of power in this in terms of trying to kind of take control of the sales process from the very first conversation. And I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples of what I mean by that. Firstly, we tend to work best with clients who. This sets the stall out from the beginning to say, this is typically what our ideal client looks like. We don't just work with anyone. This is what the typical client that we work with that's a good fit for us. So there's an element whereby they might be able to sort of self-qualify themselves at this point and say, well, actually, yeah, we're not quite sure we're there, or that isn't the challenge we're facing. The purpose of this first conversation, what we're doing here is we're outlining that we're not just going to rush through a sales process. We have a process that we follow, and this is just the first conversation within that process. And again, that's backed up with this second point here, that if we agree there's a good fit, then there will be a next step in our process, which will involve a deeper dive discovery type conversation. We're not going to be able to cover everything we want to on this initial half-hour call. Its purpose is to broadly establish if there's a good fit, and then we'll have that deeper dive conversation later on. And this last bit's really important. One of the biggest signs that you are favored by the prospect, perhaps versus other agencies they're speaking to, is whether they will grant you access to other stakeholders outside of the person you are speaking to. So this is an attempt to try and tee that up at this stage, to say, if we go to that next step, if we have that deeper dive discovery meeting, I would suggest that we then start to bring in other stakeholders at that point. So it's kind of laying the foundations to do that. So let's assume you've sent that email, they've come back and gone, yeah, sounds good. You get the call in the diary. Let's look at some of the specific questions that you might ask during the course of that conversation. So some real sort of practical advice to come with regards to the next steps. So I've developed a very, very simple, what I call a where, what, why, who qualifying conversation framework. And just to kind of make the point, when it comes to sales conversations, ultimately, the whole sales process is made up of a series of conversations. And if you want to become more effective at selling, you need to go away and learn how to master each of those conversations. And each of those conversations should have a framework. Now, what we don't want to do is create out of all of you a very robotic, very scripted approach to these sales conversations. There is nothing worse than being on the end of a sales call, and no matter what you say, the person just moves on to the next question. It doesn't sound like they're listening to you at all. They've obviously got this script in front of them. They've been trained in some methodology like spin selling, and they can't divert away from it. They are literally just going through things question by question. A framework is not the objective here, or the objective of a framework is not to create that very scripted conversation. Neither do we want to be so loose in our approach to the sales process that we get to the end of it and go, I'm not sure I actually asked half the questions I wanted to ask. So a framework provides some structure, but it also allows a certain degree of flexibility for you to be able to pick and choose the questions and the language that you feel most comfortable with. So let's just think about this qualifying conversation, the where, the what, the why, the who. What do I mean by that? Where did they find you? And we're going to break each of these down in a couple of moments. But where did they find you? And what you're really trying to understand through this line of questioning is whether you have any kind of advantage versus other agencies they may be speaking to. Who, what are they looking for? So this is about the brief. Broadly speaking, what are they looking for? Is that the right kind of fit for our kind of expertise? And during the course of that conversation, you're really looking to understand their ability to invest at the appropriate level. We should be talking about money early in our conversation, and whether they are willing to explore different ideas compared to the solution that they think is right. Bearing in mind that what a client thinks they want and what they actually need can often be quite different. Why now? I think this is really, really important in the current climate. Why is this thing you are wanting to speak to us about a priority right now? We're really trying to understand what is the timeline for you moving forward with this particular project. And who? This goes back to my earlier point about trying to involve stakeholders. This is going to be hugely revealing with regards to what extent can you really lead this sales process rather than be led by the client themselves. And a key signal is that ability to gain access to other stakeholders. So let's just break this down and give you some example questions you might pose. So the first question you want to ask when you get on the phone, if it hasn't already been made obvious in their communication, is how did you find us? And the build to that is then what encouraged you to specifically get in touch with us today? The reason why we want to ask that question is because if they turn around and say something like, we've been following you for a long time, we saw you speak at an event last week, we downloaded your white paper, you're working with a client that we really respect and would like to emulate, that says to me there's a specific reason why they have reached out to you, and you potentially have an advantage in the sales process versus other agencies they may be speaking to. If they say something like, we were just looking around Google, whacked in a few searches and you came up top, or we use ChatGPT and you're one of the agencies that it chucked out at the other end, that says to me they're probably still in research mode. They haven't created their short list of agencies. They're not really sure what they want and who they want it for. So that is potentially a little bit of a red flag for me. So that first question, really, really critical. We want to find out who else they're speaking to. Are you speaking to other agencies first and foremost, or actually are we the only one in the running, which would clearly be an ideal scenario, but that would be quite revealing, particularly off the back of that first question, that actually they've reached out to you specifically. There's a reason for that, and actually we're not speaking to anybody else. That would be lovely, but actually that very rarely happens. I always used to ask in a slightly cheeky way, do you mind me asking who else you're speaking to? What other agencies are in the mix? People are often scared of asking that question. What have you got to lose? You might as well ask. I was always amazed at the number of times when I asked that question, how often the prospect would turn around and say, well, actually, the last guy I spoke to, he asked the same question and I told him, so I should probably tell you too. So don't be scared of asking who else is in the mix. If they don't want to respond to that question, which is fair enough, you might want to understand a bit more about the criteria that they've used to shortlist agencies. You know, what is that criteria made up of? Again, you're trying to understand why they've reached out to you and who else they might be speaking to. We really want to understand, and I've got some stats here that I'll just have to look down at my desk for. We really want to understand if the existing agency are repitching for the business. Is there an incumbent involved? The reason why you want to ask that question is there was a study from Forrester last year that said that the incumbent agency, if they were involved in the repitch, will win it 66% of the time. So you really want to understand if the incumbent is involved in that process. It, for me, is such a waste of time going through the process if all you're ever going to do is reappoint the incumbent. But often clients have to go through that process to understand what's out in the marketplace, but they end up reappointing the incumbent anyway. But just be aware if the incumbent is involved, that is a bit of a red flag. What are they looking for? At this stage, we want to build a general picture. We're not going to go too deep into their requirements. We just want to broadly understand, what are you actually looking for? What is the nature of this piece of work, project, whatever it may be? This is the starting point for a deeper conversation later on. And what I'm saying here is we want to split out the qualifying conversation and the discovery style conversation. So but that doesn't mean at this stage we don't want to broadly understand that what they're looking for is kind of the right fit for us, and actually it's a good fit for our kind of expertise. So, you know, fairly broad questions. Tell me a bit about your current situation and how we can help. This is a great question that I stole from Blair Enns, if you know who that is. And I think it's a really good future-facing kind of outcome-orientated question. Imagine we're speaking a year from now, you're delighted with your progress. What's happened to make you so happy? So that's a lovely kind of future-facing, outcome-orientated question that can really have them open up in terms of what they're looking for, outcome-based. What would you say is currently standing in your way? That's the reason why people work with agencies, because they've got a problem they can't address. So at this stage, we're starting to try and get a feel for what is the specific problem or problems they are looking to address. I kind of suggested this earlier. We want to start talking about money as early on in our dialogue as we possibly can. Do not leave money to chance. We tend to be, particularly if you're based here in England, we tend to be quite reserved about talking about money, particularly in a personal setting. In a business setting, there are no excuses. We should be talking about money upfront and early. So what are your expectations in terms of investment? How did you arrive at that figure? I really like the word investment rather than budget or cost, for example. What is this going to cost? Cost is a real negative for me. Investment suggests if I put something in, I'm going to get something back. So lean into the language of investment rather than budget. How did you arrive at that figure? And then also we want to understand, again, I alluded to this earlier, if what they think they want to buy is the right thing. Now, sometimes a client will come to you with a self-diagnosis and they'll come up with their own solution, but that may not necessarily be the right one. So what we're trying to understand here is their flexibility in their thinking. If they think they want one thing, but we actually think they need another, are they open to the idea of exploring different ideas, different options compared to the one that they think they want to buy? Why now? Critical, as I suggested earlier, that we really try to establish a timeline for when they want to get started. And I think if we talk about dither, delay, indecision, things going on hold, this is a really critical part of the conversation. How long have you been thinking about this? What has made you decide to move forward with this now? Are example questions you could use. Where does this feature on your list of priorities? We all know that clients have got a to-do list with 101 things on it. We want to kind of understand how much of a priority is this particular thing that we are talking about. Are there any other projects you're working on right now that might prevent you from moving forward with this one in the near future? When does this need to be implemented? You might want to do a more future-facing question and then work back from there in terms of when you need to get started. Why is that date important and what happens if it slips? So these are all examples of questions you can use to try and establish that all-important timeline. And who needs to be involved? As I said, your ability to gain direct access to stakeholders is perhaps one of the biggest indicators of how different you are seen by the prospect compared to other agencies. So seek to understand who else needs to be involved and can you try and get direct access to those stakeholders at some point during the process. So what stages will you be working through to come to a decision? What will happen at each of these stages? Would you mind if I suggested some additional steps to ensure that we put together a proposal that is right? And then you describe what those additional steps are in your process. Who else does this project impact? And then it's almost assumptive. We are going to involve them. You're not really asking if we should involve them. You're almost asking when. How and when should we get them involved in the process? Now, if you want to be really objective about this, and I love objectivity in sales, it doesn't take away gut feel. I think we all have those leads come in where they just don't feel right, and we can't quite put our finger on it. But I'm a big believer in trying to make your sales process as objective as you possibly can. And you can use a qualifying scorecard that might look something like this. This reflects the parts of the framework that I referred to a few moments ago, and you can score the opportunity and use that as a measure with regards to deciding how, if and how you progress and move things forward. This is just an example. You might have your own criteria that you want to incorporate within this, but it's just to say you can make sales an objective exercise as far as you possibly can. Last couple of bits before we open up the floor for questions. Do not ignore the red flags. I see this all the time. When I'm talking to a client about an opportunity, and we start to kind of drill into some of the detail, I tend to find that quite often they've made a huge number of assumptions and they haven't asked the right questions. A shining example of that would be, do you know what they are willing and able to invest? And the person leading the sales opportunity will be, no, we're going to put that into the proposal at the end. No, no, no. If you don't find out that information early on, you are leaving things to chance. You are leading a sales process based on hope. And actually what we want to do with our sales process is gather all the information we can and be able to make a really informed decision about if and how we move things forward. So if there are red flags, if there are things just at the back of your mind that don't quite feel right, address them before you move on to the next step. And this is a really simple framework, again, that you can use. This is taken from a book called Let's Get Real or Let's Not Play by Mahan Khalsa and Randy Illich. And it's just a really simple way of addressing any of those concerns that you might have. And it's broken down into 3 parts. Before we progress, I have a concern. You would then state that potential concern or problem, and then you throw things back over to the client and you ask them what they think should happen next. Let's just bring that to life with a real example. Can I share with you a concern I have before we progress any further? So this is the sort of thing you would say perhaps towards the end of your qualifying conversation. I understand you're wary about bringing other people into the conversation. Can I share something with you? In my experience, if we don't involve those who are impacted by this problem early in the process, it's much more difficult to get their buy-in to the solution later on. What do you think we should do? So you throw it back over to the prospect. So really, really kind of simple framework you can use to try and uncover and resolve those concerns early, rather than leave them to chance and have to address them much later in the process. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that in that in my slides earlier on and in the scorecard, there were some words that were capitalized. Now, this is to emphasize my broader approach to the sales process. So one of my mentors many years ago said to me that the sales process is about gaining lots of small yeses. And if you gain lots of small yeses, you stand a much bigger chance of gaining the big yes at the end, which is, we would like to work with you. And then a few years ago, I read a book by an American sort of sales advisor consultant called Anthony Iannarino. And he's written a few sales books, but I read his book called The Lost Art of Closing. And he talks about the fact that closing happens in stages. If you want to get that big yes at the end, then there are a series of smaller closes that you need to gain along the way. And these are those smaller closes. Examples of those are the ability to invest at an appropriate level, a willingness to explore different ideas and opportunities, a timeline for getting started. These are the 3 that I think you need to hone in on as part of your qualifying conversation. But as we move through the sales process, there are other small closes or small yeses that you need to acquire in order to make sure that you can move forward through the sales process with confidence, building consensus, so bringing in those stakeholders. Actually, probably the biggest commitment or close you're looking to gain is that they're actually willing and able to change, that they're actually going to do the thing that you want them to do, and they understand the compromises and the things they're going to need to internally to make that a success, and so on and so on. And as you gain these small closes or commitments, as they are, you stand a much better chance of being able to close the business at the end and have the client make that all important decision. And that's the one thing that we really haven't seen enough of in the last 12 to 18 months, a final decision being made. If you focus on gaining these smaller closes earlier in the process, you will stand a much better chance of either getting a decision or deciding to step away from the process sooner without wasting too much of your time. The problem with the sales process is like this: there just aren't enough steps, not enough conversations, in other words, to gain each of those all important small closes. So the one thing I would encourage you to do from today is talk to your prospects more regularly during the sales process. Don't have one conversation at the beginning and then commit to writing a proposal. Break your sales process down into at least 3 or 4 conversations that you have along the way that allow you to gather the appropriate information, gain those all important smaller closes or yeses, build rapport, and give yourself stop gaps whereby you review things and make a decision as to whether you should move forward or whether you should step back. So finally, your takeaways before we open up the floor. Qualifying is an exercise to determine if you and the prospect are a good fit, But remember, it's not a one-off event. It's not a conversation you have for half an hour at the beginning of the sales process, and then that's it. You're not going to be able to gather all the information you need from that first conversation. So treat qualifying as something that needs to happen during the course of the process, bearing in mind that things often change during the course of that process as well, particularly for longer lead times for complex products and services. Your ideal client profile, if you haven't got one, go and get that down on paper. That acts as your framework. It's the basis by which you qualify. Explain the purpose of your qualifying conversation. That has a significant impact on the power dynamic and your ability to lead the process from the first conversation. Gaining direct access to stakeholders, it's one of the biggest indicators of how different you are seen by the prospect. So try and establish that early on in the process. That's a really good test of the water, as it were, to see how you are viewed and seen by that client. Always seek to resolve your concerns or objections early. They're only ever going to surface later on. So you might as well try and address them early rather than leave them to chance and have a whole load of objections you've got to try and counter at the presentation meeting, for example. And as I said just now, more broadly, closing, as it were, is not just a question or an act that happens at the end of the sales process. Closing happens in stages. If you're going to earn the right to ask the prospect for their business, you need to secure several smaller closes first. Now, if you haven't read the book, go and look for Anthony Iannarino, The Lost Art of Closing. He's also got a great blog called The Sales Blog. He is fantastic. So I've taken a lot of the ideas and theories and so on from the likes of Anthony, Blair Enns, and so on. And just to finish off, there's a few resources here, a few articles, one or two by yours truly, others by others that I respect in the market. So there's a few extra resources, articles that build on some of the ideas that we've spoken about today. And if you don't already and want to, I'd be honoured if you found me on LinkedIn and either followed or connected with me. All the details are there, and again, I will share this deck with you after today.